Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see those of you joining us on Zoom, and lovely to see those of you in person on our first snowy day of the year. So we're particularly grateful that people trekked through the wet weather to get here. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank the Department of History and the Nugent Fund and Bronwyn Jakes for helping us organize this, and a special thanks to Vasily Shedrin, the director of the Russian East European Studies Network, who has done so much to pull all of our programming together and who's gotten this setup also ready for us today. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Elena Osokina here to Queens. Dr. Osokina is a professor at the University of South Carolina, and she is an internationally recognized specialist in the history of the social and economic history of the Stalin era in the Soviet Union. She has received fellowships and held visiting positions at a whole host of institutions and from a whole host of organizations, including the American Council of Learned Societies, the Kennan Institute, Woodrow Wilson Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Hoover, the Davis Center for Russian and East European Studies, and the list goes on. She has also disseminated her research in a number of, in Russia, the United States, and in Canada on radio, so you can hear her on the CBC. She's the author of a long list of publications, and I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I am going to single out her major books, all of which have made important contributions to the field. The first book, which was translated into English as Our Daily Bread, Socialist Distribution and the Art of Survival in Stalin's Russia, 1927 to 1941, was really a landmark study in the history of consumption and trade under socialism, underscoring both the importance of official distribution networks as well as the black market in the functioning of the economic system. The book was important for many generations of scholars, and its significance, I think, is really testified to by the fact that the Russian edition just came out with the Russian publisher just came out with its third edition of the book with a new introduction this year. Dr. Osokina's subsequent books addressed two really interesting and relatively unknown chapters in the economic history of the Stalin era. One of them, which alas has not yet been translated into English, and I think that will take some time, is titled The Heavenly Blue of Angels' Vestments, The Fate of the Masterpieces of Ancient Russian Religious Art, 1920s to 1930s. This came out in 2018 in Russia and won a major book award for the top book, it's a top book award in history in Russia. The other book-length study, which you can see the book here, addressed the Soviet Union's hard currency stores, the so-called Torgsin stores, and their role in financing industrialization. And this book was just last year translated into English by Dr. Osokina and came out with Cornell University Press, titled Stalin's Quest for Gold, the Torgsin Hard Currency Shops and Soviet Industrialization. Her talk today, I think, is going to focus on this book, and so we'll have a chance to hear more about this project. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Osokina.
Thank you, Rebecca. Right, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here. That was a very short notice from me to Rebecca. When I came to Toronto for 2 months, I decided, oh, it's a good opportunity maybe to introduce my work at the best Canadian universities. And I'm very grateful that Rebecca and her colleagues found found means and also time to invite me here. All right, so I came this morning from Toronto, and weather is much worse there, I can say. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk today about is the English translation of my older book. You can see the second edition of it in Russian. The first edition came in 2008. And this book is also translated into Chinese. And this is where the major audience is, right? Within like 2 years, they sold like 15,000 copies of it. That here in academia, we do not dream of such sales. All right. So Rebecca gave a very good overview of my research, so I have to add very little. The question then that interests me is how the Soviet government financed its industrialization. And more specifically, what were the sources, extraordinary financial sources to pay for those industrial imports that were required. Traditionally, if we look at the historiography, we'll see that in the Soviet historiography, historians and economists normally stressed the internal sources to finance industrialization, meaning that those revenues that the state received from industries were reinvested, and through these constant reinvestments, they financed it, they developed it. Here in the West, the major focus was on collectivization, and historians and economists here debated the role of collectivization as a mechanism to pump resources from the countryside to support the cities and also to provide exports in order to get foreign currency and gold. So my research tries to show that industrialization was financed through a very wide variety of sources. Some of them are very exotic, and some of them are extremely important, and we didn't know anything about it before. Right? So one of the sources was Torgsin. Right? Torgsin is an abbreviation, a Russian abbreviation that stands for Trade with Foreigners. That was a chain of the state hard currency stores that appeared in 1930 and initially provided only for foreign tourists and those foreigners that were in transit in the Soviet Union. However, before talking about Torgsin, the question that we need to answer, why the government was in such a difficult situation, why they had to look for some extraordinary financial sources for gold and foreign currency. Right? So the answer to this question is that they were currency bankrupts. And it is a very unusual answer, because we all know that the Russian Empire was a very wealthy country. According to some contemporaries, the Russian imperial gold reserve was the biggest among the state banks in those days. Others believe that it's second only to France. Right. So all in all, before the revolution, the Russian gold reserve was 1.7 billion gold rubles. Of course, some of this gold was spent or stolen or lost during the First World War and during the Civil War and the revolutionary times, because the gold reserve changed hands. It's a very interesting story, adventure. However, regardless, the Bolsheviks, when they won in the Civil War, they still possessed a very handsome amount of gold and foreign currencies. You can see close to 1 billion rubles. However, already in a few years, by the beginning of the 1920s, these gold reserves disappeared. All this gold had been exhausted. In this book, there is a special chapter that actually gives the answer where the gold went. To give you a short answer, because it's really not the major focus of the presentation, I can tell you that there were two major ways that when they spent it. The first one, they tried to bring the world revolution. They supported the communist movement and established espionage work in the world, and through their Comintern, and they spent a lot of imperial gold and currency to support that. And the second major spending was a trade, foreign trade. In those days, Russia was ruined by the revolutions and wars. practically didn't produce anything, could not receive credits because it was the only communist country. So it had to buy everything from abroad just in exchange for gold or foreign currency. So by the beginning of the 1920s, as you can see, what was remained was a little bit over 200 million gold rubles. So so when they started the industrialization at the end of the 1920s, they had to answer this question, how to finance it. This type of industrialization that they began with the focus on heavy industry and military production was a very expensive project. It required purchases abroad, technologies, industrial raw materials, machinery, aid of foreign specialists, but no gold and foreign currency, how to pay for it. So initially when they began the industrialization, they believed that they would be able to pay, to finance it through their export, agricultural export, right? Mostly grain. The beginning of industrialization in 1927-28 was favorable. The conditions were not bad. However, we all know what happened in 1929 when the world crisis began, and then Great Depression. Prices for agricultural produce dropped on the world market, while prices for machinery grew. So the Soviet government faced the situation that the export could not provide enough for their very ambitious industrialization project. Right? They tried to compensate this the decrease in prices by increasing the physical volumes of food and agricultural resources that they exported. And by doing this, they made the market situation within the country much worse, pretty much making their population starve. So another possible source for them to get gold was, of course, the gold mining industry. However, it didn't work either, because during the war and the revolutions, it pretty much collapsed. And if you compare the statistics, before the First World War in 1913, Russia produced more than 60 tons of pure gold, while by the end of the Civil War, 1921-22, only 8 tons. And by the beginning of industrialization, a little bit over 20,000 tons of pure gold. So they could use this gold, but once again, it was not sufficient. Right. So they began the industrialization, and they believed they could postpone it, or they couldn't slow it down, because they expected the war at any moment. They were not sure who they would be fighting against, but they knew that the war was coming at any minute. So they tried to industrialize really very quickly. So when they began the industrialization, they were gold and currency bankrupts. Some believed that their gold reserve was negative, meaning that there were more debts than gold, right? And what was in their possession, around a little bit over 200 million gold rubles, was not even enough to pay the trade deficit of the next year. This is why we can see how at the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s, there was a panic in the Soviet leadership of the gold and currency. They were looking for any means to finance industrialization, and they used small things, big things. They didn't stop short to commit crimes for fake dollars, for example. There was those who worked with the archival documents, that they saw this panic. They saw how they tried to economize on everything and to find any little golden thread. Right. So one of this example of this golden panic over gold in foreign currency is the sale of art. And we know that, for example, the Imperial Hermitage from St. Petersburg and Leningrad at that time suffered tremendously. 21 masterpieces, the best paintings were sold to Andrew Mellon, who was the Minister of Treasury of the United States at that time. So this is the book that Rebecca mentioned from 2020. It's only available in Russian at this moment, which tells the story of export of religious art. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it today. The day after tomorrow, I will be delivering a talk on this book in Montreal. Yeah. So, but just to give you some intriguing point here. This book reveals a very interesting paradox. While within the country, the Soviet leadership treated icons as a religious object, as an object of the hatred of religion, harmful, right? For the outside of the world, they presented it as precious art and a new commodity. So we deal with a very interesting phenomenon when the founders of the non-market economy, the state centralized economy, non-market in the quotation marks, and I'm going to say more about it. But, the people who founded this state centralized economy at the same time became the founders of the world market of Russian religious art. So they acted in the interest of the industrialization with the economic goal. So they sold these icons not for ideological reasons, but for economic reasons. They acted very practical in this sense. With these numbers, because my previous talk at where was it? McMaster, right? So they asked me what are those numbers. This is a very famous photograph from 1936, which shows the exhibition, but also sale of Russian Orthodox icons in Moscow. And I found these icons that when you see numbers, I traced them and I found where they are, what happened to them, from where they came, from what universities, museums they came for sale, and where they are now. So I plan to translate this book into English, but it will take time. Right. So so we will just go through this and return back to Torgsin. So Torgsin was another extraordinary financial source for the Soviet government to finance industrialization. As I said, it appeared in 1930s and initially provided only for foreigners. Soviet customers were not allowed even to enter its stores. Right? And at that time, there was a very small trade office. It had only a few stores in big cities and in seaports where there were foreign sailors. However, already in 1931, the government opened Torgsin for Soviet people. So its own name, trade with foreigners, became false, incorrect, because now the Soviet people were allowed to shop in these stores. So they couldn't just come to these stores and pay for produce with paper rubles, regular currency. They had to bring their heirlooms. So initially, they were allowed to bring cash, foreign cash, or to have money transfers from abroad. Then they were allowed to bring imperial gold coins. Then by the end of 1931, there was really a revolution in Torgsin's activity. Soviet people were allowed to bring household items, gold items, jewelry, or just household items like, for example, spoons and this type of things. With time, they were allowed to bring silver, platinum, precious stones, semi-precious stones, antiques. So what is interesting here that we see how actually people were even showing the government what the government could take from them. Because I said initially people were allowed only to bring gold imperial coins, for example, or household items. Yes?
Again, I'm very sorry. The people on the internet do not see the slides, so can we switch to the not full screen mode?
Yeah,
I'll do it.
yeah. Sorry, you should have
I'm
told
very
me.
sorry.
Yeah, you should have told me.
I didn't know. I just emailed one of them to check if everything is okay. The sound is excellent, but they don't see slides.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right. Yeah, but the text is more important, you know,
Yeah.
verbal. However, pictures are always a plus. Right. Yes. So first of all, why people were bringing their valuables to Torgsin? In order to understand it and why Torgsin began to grow so quickly after Soviet people were allowed to come, is what we have to look what it was in the Soviet Union during the first half of the 1930s. That was the time of the rationing system. When government started industrialization, they decided to do it based on the state centralized economy without a private sector. So they began to use repressions against the private sector of the 1920s, the so-called the new economic policy in the Soviet Union. And by the destruction of the private sector and that collectivization followed when they destroyed peasant economy. So they created a very acute supply crisis. Rations began to spread first by initiative of the local authorities spontaneously. And then in 1931, the nationwide rationing system was introduced. It was very hierarchical and insufficient. For example, peasants who constituted over 80% of the population, 80, did not receive ration cards. They had to provide for themselves. The rationing system was one of the methods of industrialization. In my book, I call it the method of carrot and stick, right? So they use these rations to provide for those who were directly involved in the industrial production. Industrial workers, industrial engineers received the best rations. If we don't count the elite, of course, the army that always received the best supplies, right? So when the government opened Torgsin, it began to use at lightning speed because people were starving. And we all know that in 1932, 1933, mass famine happened in the Soviet Union. Millions people, mostly peasants, were dying. So for them, Torgsin became one of the major strategies to survive, right? And lucky were those who had what to bring to Torgsin valuables. So how did it exactly work if you wanted to use Torgsin? I don't know if you see well here, this corner. These are two appraisers, and there is a scale in front of them. So the first thing you have to do before buying, you have to bring your valuables to the appraisers. They will tell you the price. And if you agree, then they will take it from you and give you Torgsin's money. You see an example of the early Torgsin money, one kopic, gold kopic. So they were just pieces of simple paper, easy to make. With time, the government had to make something more sophisticated, like personal books with coupons that had to be cut. So you come to the store, you give your valuables, your heirlooms, and in exchange you receive this paper money of Torgsin, and with this money you can go to its stores and to buy there. It's just one of the stores in Ukraine, and I think it's in Kyiv, and it shows pretty much the assortment of an ordinary Torgsin stores. So nothing extraordinary, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. So when Torgsin opened its doors to the Soviet people, it began it began to develop really quickly. At the highest point of Torgsin activity, there were 1,500 stores in the Soviet Union. Here on this, I love this brochure, which is in English, because the representatives of Torgsin were also abroad. They encourage foreigners to send money for their relatives in the Soviet Union on Torgsin. Right, and it shows like the whole territory of the Soviet Union from the western border to the far east, from the north. And you can see like Torgsin, those stores with lights in the big cities, and it signals out a few big cities where Torgsin operated. In reality, Torgsin, at least one Torgsin store was in every big city and in small towns sometimes. In Moscow, Leningrad, there were dozens of Torgsin stores just within one city. So really, that was a triumph of Torgsin, this lightning growth. But this triumph was a result of tragedy. Starvation, hunger pushed people to Torgsin. People were bringing their valuables in exchange for very simple things: grain, bread, groats, sugar, vegetable oil, right? So just to illustrate my point, I show you here two photographs of Torgsin. One is the elite Torgsin. Those of you who know that the novel Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, there is a wonderful episode in this book where two of his characters came to a Torgsin store in Moscow on this Smolensk square, and they began a fire there. They burned it down. So the description of this Torgsin, according to Bulgakov, was a wonderful store. You could see a lot of luxurious items there, all this oranges, pyramids of chocolates, salmon. In other departments, there were like a wide variety of shoes, fabric. However, there were these stores like that. There were Torgsins like Bulgakov described. And one of the examples here is an antique Torgsin store in Moscow. You can see that they offer fine china for sale. But the majority of Torgsin stores were just ordinary stores. Nothing really, there's nothing to write home about. However, what Torgsin offered at that time was precious, because that was the question of survival. People did not want to buy furs or carpets or paintings. They needed flour. They needed groats, sugar for their children, right? So here you see one of the examples. This is Kharkiv in Ukraine, 1933. So this is the year of mass famine, right? And if you look at this photograph, not knowing what it is on this photograph, you will probably you will forget it in a second. But in reality, this photograph is very interesting, because this small building here is Torgsin, and all these people on the streets is not just pedestrians, a crowd, a street crowd. These are people who would like to buy in Torgsin. This is the line to buy bread in Torgsin. So this photograph is one of several that an Austrian engineer, Alexander Wennerberger, was able to smuggle from Ukraine during the famine. He smuggled the negatives of the photographs, and we have this document now thanks to him. So the antipodes, luxury for foreigners and very simple things for ordinary people, right? So the finest hour of Torgsin, the hour of triumph, was of course the mass famine. And here you see the illustration from my popular book on Torgsin. It's called The Alchemy of Soviet Industrialization. It's the series What Russia Is. This is the illustration by a wonderful Moscow artist Maria Shishova. What it shows, it is an illustration to a well-known, famous, at least among the Russians, novel by Viktor Astafyev. Viktor Astafyev, who at that time was a boy, that's Viktor Astafyev, that boy on this picture. So he lived in a small village in Siberia. And he writes about this famine in his book. He writes that in 1933, peasants from that village began to go to a neighboring store, bringing their whatever valuable possessions they had to buy just simple things, to buy flour, right? So his family had just one golden item, the earrings, golden earrings of his mother. This is his grandmother. So his mother died several years before that. So during that mass famine, his grandmother took these earrings that were kept in the family as a memory about her, and also for the rainy day. And they took these earrings to Torgsin, and it allowed them to survive this worst time. The winter of 1932-33. So this statistics is very revealing. In 1933, this is the worst moment of the mass famine. People brought to Torgsin 45 tons of pure gold. 45 tons of pure gold. If you compare it with the industrial mining, you'll see that the industrial mining that year gave a little bit over 50 tons of pure gold, and Gulag, Dalstroy, where prisoners labored, gave only 1.8. Dalstroy was started its work only in 1932, so it still had time to develop, right? So it's just, in my opinion, it's shocking. It's tremendous. It shows that people finance industrialization against their will. They went to Torgsin voluntarily, so to speak, but that was famine that actually drove them to Torgsin. Here, I just want maybe to compare Torgsin with the political police at that time, OGPU, or GPU, or NKVD and NKVD at that time. The political police also had its quarters to provide gold and foreign currency for industrialization. However, it did it by force, by confiscations. They pretty much chased people, searched their apartments. Torgsin proved to be more successful because famine did all work here. Famine drove people to Torgsin. So what the political police did in this situation, they used Torgsin to find those in possession with valuables. Right? It facilitated the search for them. They observed Torgsin stores, they received information from the administration in the stores, and they just followed customers to their homes, searched their homes, confiscated gold and foreign currency. So what the political police did was illegal, because Torgsin worked legally, openly. People were allowed to come to Torgsin to bring their possessions, and if they were allowed to bring it to Torgsin, they were allowed to have them. Right, that was the logic. The political police said that they were fighting speculation, but in reality, they punished people for very simple and legal actions. Right. So this story about Torgsin and the political police allowed me to think about, or make me think about what Soviet everyday life was, right? And in one of the chapters in this book is called a habit of adventure, a custom of risk. Soviet everyday life required heroism. Even very simple things, trivial things like shopping, to go to a store to buy bread or pants, could be unpredictable, right? You could be arrested, your possessions could be confiscated, your home could be searched, right? So, of course, Torgsin sounded alarm after all these actions because people stopped coming to its stores. They were afraid, right? But with time, famine, hunger made them go again. So, so I call Torgsin the sorcerer's stone, and one of the books, as I said, is called, has the title "The Alchemy of Soviet Industrialization." Why? Because Torgsin turned very simple things, Soviet paper rubles that were not convertible at that time, and such simple foods as flour, groats, sugar, vegetable oil, it turned them into foreign currency and gold. So that it really functioned as sorcerer's stone that turned simple matter into gold. So if you look at the final result of Torgsin work, and it existed only until February of 1936 for about 5 years, so a very short period of time. So you can see that altogether, all these types of valuables that he gathered was worth of 287 million gold rubles. If you calculate based on Torgsin purchasing price for gold at that time, it is an equivalent of 220 tons of pure gold. At the same time, the gold industrial mining during the first half of the 1930s gave 294 tons of pure gold. It's very comparable, very similar. And Gulag, only 21 tons of pure gold. So we see that really that that contribution of Torgsin, contribution of people to industrialization was very significant. All right. So there were several mechanisms that allowed government to capitalize on Torgsin. What were those mechanisms actually? How this sorcerer's stone worked? First of all, Torgsin bought valuables at the prices lower than the world prices for gold, silver, precious metals, or precious stones. So the government underpaid people for their valuables. Torgsin was not a pawn shop. If you gave your valuables to Torgsin, you could not take them back. They were destroyed, broken, and then melted into bars and then sold at the world market. So you could make many masterpieces, as a matter of fact, were destroyed in Torgsin. There are plenty of documents that show that people brought artistic and historical valuable items that were turned into this metal scrap. Right? So, so that was one element that allowed the government to capitalize on Torgsin. And the second was Torgsin prices, because Torgsin, on the one hand, it purchased valuables, and on the other hand, it sold food and goods to people in exchange for their valuables. So Torgsin's prices for food and goods were the highest in the country. Right. So, and the highest among them was the prices during the mass famine. And we have to think about it. Just we are dealing with the socialist state, right? With socialism, right? At least this is how they presented it. And we see that the Soviet government did not help its citizens during the mass famine. The Soviet government used this famine to capitalize on this famine. And there were constant orders from above to increase prices on food in Torgsin. And during the winter of 1932-33, prices for major food, like flour, were increased 2 times in a row. They were not increased 2 times, but they were increased 2 times in a row, once and then next time. So the government wanted to take as much as possible from the people using this situation of hungry demand. So it kind of makes us think about what the Soviet economy was and what we're dealing with this. One of the chapters in the book calls Torgsin a capitalist enterprise of socialist state, because we see that the state used prices, high demand, and the state monopoly on prices to capitalize. In my opinion, it's an example, a very interesting example of the very successful, economically successful state entrepreneurial activity, when state acted as a capitalist, right? Using the situation, using market mechanisms. So in my opinion, we are dealing here with state capitalism, right? So as I said, there was not even a gram of socialism in Torgsin. So it acted like a capitalist enterprise that used the market situation to receive revenues, to receive income, profit. Right? So another mechanism here, as I said, prices in Torgsin were higher than the Soviet export prices. It means that the Soviet government sold food to its citizens on average 3.3 times higher than the war export prices for the same items. Of course, it is not because the Soviet government loved foreigners so much, because the prices, the economic situation outside of the Soviet Union was different. A Great Depression, embargoes, so they could not increase prices there. It was out of their capacity. But within the country, when they are in this relative isolation with famine, very high demand, that they could dictate any prices that the market situation allowed, right? So for some items like the bread group here, we see that the prices within Torgsin were 5 times higher than the Soviet export prices for the same items. Torgsin during the mass famine outperformed the major Soviet exporters of oil, timber, grain. That was a short period of time, but the currency efficiency of Torgsin was very high at this time, thanks to the hungry demand. So we're coming to the final slides here. As I said, the name Torgsin, trade with foreigners, is not really correct. In my opinion, they should have told it called it Torgsov Lud, which means trade with Soviet people, because the major customers in Torgsin were Soviet people. And the valuables, about 70–80% of all valuables in Torgsin came from the Soviet people, not from foreigners, So if you look at the final results of Torgsin's activities, you'll see that those valuables that it accumulated allowed the government to buy industrial equipment for 10 giant industrial enterprises like Kuzbask, Dneprostroy, Magnitka. So they were very proud of their industrial construction, those industrial enterprises, and see that Torgsin, it doesn't mean that the money of Torgsin went directly to pay for this equipment, but the amount that it accumulated was enough to pay for those imports. On average, Torgsin during the first half of the 1930s covered 1/5 of Soviet industrial imports, and during the famine 1/3, right? So this is exactly what made Torgsin so interesting to me, because that was the first document, final report that I found when I worked on my book on the rationing system. And when I read that final report and learned that Torgsin covered 1/3 of the industrial empires, I was so fascinated with that I began this research, and it showed just a shocking picture. Right. So now conclusions here. Some conceptual conclusions that I would like to make after this, telling you the story of Torgsin. First of all, as I said, it shows that industrialization was financed from a very wide variety of sources. Art export, Torgsin, and some of them, like Torgsin, were very, very profitable and effective. The contribution was very high. The second, what can we say about Soviet economy based on this story? Right. We know that traditionally and during the Cold War, the Soviet economy was viewed as an antipode of capitalist economy. They were like two extremes, market and plan, right? So in my research, it's not only in this book, and practically in all of my books and articles, I try to change this opinion. I show Soviet economy as a symbiosis of the state regulations, centralization, and markets. They were legal markets and they were limited, for example, the collective farm market, but there was a tremendous black market also existed around Torgsin. It's another interesting story about prostitution in Torgsin that I can explain later. So a huge black market. My book, Our Daily Bread, it pretty much documents the existence of that black market, which shows that myth that people were afraid under Stalin and there was discipline and order. It's a myth. In reality, people were very active because they had to survive. They wanted to improve their material conditions. They were very active in pursuing their goals, and through their activities, the black market developed. But the story of Torgsin also shows that the state used marketing strategies. Torgsin was the successful large-scale enterprise. Also, just when I talked a little bit about my other book, we see that the Soviet Union contributed to the world market, art market, by offering a new commodity, the Orthodox icons that were almost unknown to the world at that time. So the Soviet economy emerges from this research as a symbiosis. And in my opinion, the capitalist economy and the Soviet economy, they were not twins, but they were relatives. They were made of the same elements, state regulations and markets. The difference between them was not that the Soviet economy did not have a market. The difference is in the ratio between the state regulation, centralization, and markets. But the elements were the same. And in my opinion, this juxtaposition, plan and market, it belongs more to ideology and political history, to the Cold War. And if we look from an economic point of view, we'll see that they are both modern economists of the 20th century, and they use the same elements, but in different proportions and ratio. Right. So another interesting, important conclusion, nature of Stalinism. If you are familiar with how historiography of Stalinism developed, you know that the political historians were first, and they presented Stalinism as a political ideological phenomenon. For them, that was terror, ideology, total control, passive society, right? So then the social historians came in 1970s, 80s, and they showed Stalinism as a social phenomenon. They showed that there were social roots, there were groups in the society that supported these reforms, that there were conflicts within the society that actually led to terror and to Stalinism. Then the postmodernists came, and Stalinism became a cultural historian. If you know Kotkin's book, Magnetic Mountain, you see that he talks about Stalinism as a new civilization with its own behavior, speech, right? So from my research, Stalinism emerges as a socioeconomic phenomenon. And it's a new dimension of Stalinism. I showed that the core principle of Stalinism was industrialization. That was their fetish. And they were ready to sacrifice ideological postulates to this fetish. For example, with Torgsin, we see what exactly they sacrifice here. Marketless economy, right? Then class approach, because in Torgsin there were no discrimination by your social background that was very typical in the Soviet Union at that time. The government didn't care who brought gold to Torgsin. It could be a peasant, it could be a worker, it could be a lishenets, the person who was deprived of political rights. It's what mattered how much you brought it. So you see, also with Torgsin, we see that the government sacrificed the principle of the state currency and gold monopoly, also one of the fundamental for their political economy of socialism. So all in all, you see that Stalinism also has this dimension as a socioeconomic phenomenon, as a set of some enterprises based on industrial priorities and marketing methods, marketing techniques. So it does not deny Stalinism as a political, ideological phenomenon, but it adds to the picture and makes it more complicated and more interesting. And finally, as I said, Torgsin also allows us to think about everyday life. What was this everyday life? We see that that was a result of mutual actions of two actors, the state and people. The state tried to engineer social, economic, cultural life, but people, by adapting to this practices, they changed this policy, they adjusted it, and the final result was not exactly what people wanted or the government wanted. We see how through this mutual efforts, the everyday life was emerging, a new type of everyday life. And I think my own contribution here is to think about the Soviet everyday life as a custom of adventure and risk. I lived in the Soviet Union, of course, not under Stalin, although some of my students think that I even knew Ivan the Terrible. Yeah, so and I shall tell you that after I moved to live in the United States, I found this life very boring because it lacked emotions. In the Soviet Union, every little thing, every little like trifle was a big deal, right? People made victories and experienced tragedies over very little things. Like you stood in line for 5 hours and shoes of your size was sold off. So it's a tragedy. It wouldn't be a tragedy here, right? But it was a tragedy there. Also, but you would like it to get that kilo of flour. It's a victory. So trivial everyday things becoming big events. The Soviet everyday life was saturated with emotions, and this is what my American life lacked, and that's why I continue going back to Russia. So to get tired of these emotions and this exhaustion, even I shall say, right? So that's it, pretty much. This is the talk. The end. No, yeah, you please. Yeah.
So, including from our the Zoom people. So
I think we need to go to chat.
okay. Yeah.
We'll see how that
You're not
goes.
allowed to live without asking a question. Yeah, I will sell my since I'm a dictatorial professor. All right, what is your question?
Okay, Elena, you could step
Yeah,
right
okay.
here to be on the.
Then they have to think. All right, okay. I'm kidding. All right, thank you for coming.
Thank you for the presentation. It was lovely, very interesting.
Welcome.
I'm wondering about maybe the social dynamics that happened at the actual the places that for the skins, the way they buy the product.
Social dynamics, what do you mean
Yeah,
under
so
that?
who would work at these shops and
Oh,
the they were probably treated in the environment because they protected by the government extensively and they have bodyguard. There was a reactions from the public against people that would praise them holding products for bread and it wasn't very regulated.
Are you interested in methods or you're interested in the social composition? Or? Mhm. Yeah.
I'm wondering if that fluctuated in different regions, like with certain regions that the federal would charge you more because they saw an opportunity to do so, or was it so centralized to control? And then also would that affect the social response to who worked at these shops?
Okay.
Who are praising the drink?
All right. As far as the prices and the mechanism, that was standard through the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So the state dictated prices. Torgsin was denied of the right to actually to decide on the prices, which was a minus because it could not react quickly to adjust to the marketing situation. They waited to receive orders from above. So the prices were pretty much the same for gold everywhere. If you went to Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia, or if you went to the Russian North, the price for gold was the same. So 1 ruble 29 kopecks per gram of purity. Right, the same with silver. They could change prices with time, like for silver, platinum, they changed it, but it was done centrally. So it was not like in Kazakhstan, the price for gold was one and in Moscow different. So it was all centralized, The same with the prices for goods and foods. It was done nationwide. So when they saw that the demand, like after the mass famine, demand for this for Torgsin decreased, they involuntarily and against their will began to decrease prices. Otherwise, Torgsin was becoming unprofitable. Right. So as far as the social composition, it is a very interesting question. The major problem here is that who were those buyers and who were the sellers? With buyers, it's difficult to say because all statistics of Torgsin is based not on groups of buyers, but on types of valuables. They calculated how much gold people brought, silver. They were not interested who brought that. Right. So we only can judge indirectly, and I made this attempt to do it by comparing imperial gold coins with household possessions. Statistics and actually the analytics of Torgsin in their papers, they wrote that a flood of imperial coins indicates that peasants were coming to Torgsin. Peasants were the major hoarders of Tsarist imperial gold coins. They accumulated it during the war and the civil war when urban people, dwellers, exchange their possessions for food. So one of the analytics of Torgsin even wrote that we could see how those the gold from the underground banks from peasants are coming to Torgsin, meaning that peasants finally opened all their hidden places, those jars, boxes that were hidden in the ground, right? So now they digged it up and brought to Torgsin. So I compared this ratio between the imperial gold coins and gold household possessions. And it shows that during the mass famine, Torgsin became pretty much a peasant enterprise. It started as an urban elite enterprise, but during the mass famine, it turned into a peasant enterprise. Both the buyers of Torgsin became peasants. They went to Torgsin in mass. They finally found out Torgsin, learned about it, and they experienced the worst mass famine within the population. So they became the major buyers. And also as far as sellers in Torgsin, people who worked there, they were mostly, there is statistics on the employees of Torgsin, and it shows that was mostly the countryside youth that escaped mass famine, collectivization, decolonization. The millions of them were going to cities to get education and employment there. And it is interesting because there was an impression of Torgsin that was an elite enterprise. But in reality, during the mass famine, you could see that turned into peasant enterprise. To a very considerable degree. After the famine, you see how the role of Torgsin diminished and peasants were not interested anymore. It became unprofitable. One of the reasons why they closed it, right? So did I answer it?
Yeah, that's a lot. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
We'll take a question from Zoom and then Zhuzha, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. This was really, really fascinating. And also, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. And also thought-provoking. I was thinking that it was, so this is a very intense period of 5 years, right? And you were talking about how this changes for those of us who were not aware of this of the Torgsin policy and what a significant impact it had as a resource for industrialization. I was wondering, so what came after this? So if you were talking about this in the context of market and state regulation, both being part of the Stalinist regime, as well as I imagine other Stalinist type regimes in the Soviet bloc. I grew up in Romania under the Ceausescu dictatorship, so there were some similarities in the way the Ceausescu regime in the early 1980s was trying to find ways of financing its projects while they were running out of resources. But so I was thinking, if we take this framework that Stalinism was not only about planning and control, but it also included market forces that at the lowest social levels, then I was wondering what came after this, after 1936? What was the market component of the regime after 1936 that continued to finance Stalinist projects of industrialization?
All right, thank you for this question. When I talk about the Soviet economy as a symbiosis of the state regulations, centralization, and market, I don't only mean Stalinism, I mean the Soviet economy in general, right? The black market existed through the whole period. I'm sure that in Romania, that you also witnessed the development of black market because shortages, they require people to get goods and food from somewhere. So after 1936, the elements, Torgsin did not exist, but many elements existed. They were still legal markets, limited, like collective farms market, cooperated, craftsmen, they existed, all this flea markets, that huge black market continued to exist. And in one of my books, Our Daily Bread, I could show how this private entrepreneurs survived within Soviet economy. They used a form of socioeconomic mimicry. They operated private business, but they masked it as a legal form of socialist production and trade. I'll give just maybe one example. There is an enterprise and there is like a canteen that works under the roof of this enterprise. This canteen is operated by one person, and we have documents, many documents that document these cases. So this person invests his own money. He buys food where he could, right? And he pays the fee to the administration of this enterprise that provides a cover for him and documents for the financial inspection, right? These documents present him as a part of the state enterprise. But if you look how it operates as a private business. And we see it, we see numerous examples of this. In not only like individuals who were private entrepreneurs. I found cases, documents, and this is the cases that were uncovered, but how many were not, right? So we see that there is like manufacturers similar how they existed before the revolution, when there is an organizer and workers who work from their homes, so-called рассеянная мануфактура, like the spread manufacture. So there are workers who work in their homes and they don't have licenses. The organizer goes from place to place, provides raw materials to them, and then collects the final product and brings it to the markets in Leningrad or in Moscow. So there were similar entrepreneurial activities in the collective farms, especially by the end of the 1930s, right? When the government suddenly discovered that the collective farms did not work, but what the chairs of these collective farms did, they gave the land of the collective farms for the individual use, right? So the collective farmland shrank, while those called the sadibные участки, those how we translated that, plots, individual plots of land of peasants, they increased. So the government tried to bring it back. So we find a lot of examples of these market activities. Torgsin is interesting because it demonstrates the state as an entrepreneur, but the society was very active in achieving their goals through this market activity. And also we should not take into account that that Soviet Union participated in the world market. It's also part of this of the market. They use these market strategies. They were not isolated. And the new research shows that traditionally we viewed that during the first half of the 1930s, the Soviet Union actively exported and imported things. And in the second half of the 1930s, it became in isolation. But the contemporary research shows that was a tendency for the whole world. That was characteristic for the entire world. So we see how that was the general trend of that time. So there are a lot of examples to show that the market still existed. And personally, in the Soviet Union, I participated in the black market myself, providing private services as the private tutor, or buying jeans, American blue jeans that we all dreamt of on the black market. I sometimes ask my students, just think about what we were dreaming when we were students. What are you dreaming of? And what we were dreaming. American jeans, chewing gum, even plastic bags with like pictures on it. I remember in my little town when I grew up, that was like a chic to, in the evening, come to the major avenue with this imported plastic bag and to go back and forth with it. So, so people found their ways.
My question is really small because you kind of just answered it now.
Okay.
I was wondering about opposing systems to the vaccine. So like, what kind of alternative people may have had in terms of acquiring those kinds of simple goods, the flour, the sugar, the whatever. So you were talking about the black market, how it was flourishing afterwards. Does that mean that the black market was still very much in use during the Torgsin years as well? To what extent did this kind of affect the two systems? I don't know. Was there some kind of overlap?
Yeah, there were several opportunities for people to get food. That was the rationing system, but as I said, it was hierarchical and not sufficient. Only the certain groups within population received ration cards, but it was the cheapest way to get. The rationing system was not free of charge. People had to pay for rations, but the prices were the lowest. So there was Torgsin, where you had to bring your valuables. There was the state commercial stores. They were called the ruble Torgsins. That people had to pay in rubles there, but the prices were astronomical. They were very high, ruble prices, and the assortment was very limited. There were collective farms markets. They still operated even during the famine, although there was not much to buy because peasants were suffering themselves. And in those days on the black market, they sold, for example, potatoes by peas or flour by saucers. It's not like by bags because such quantities didn't exist inside. So all people could produce something on their own. And they were very, very creative. One of the creative activities that I just admire was when the government allowed people to bring silver to Torgsin because not everyone had gold and not much, maybe like a golden chain or cross or like wedding ring, but that's it. So people, when the government allowed Torgsin to accept silver, what they began to do, they began to hoard Soviet silver coins that was made of imported silver. Right? The government spent currency to get the silver and then mint coins. So they melted them into just bars, or people made some simple jewelry out of this melted silver and brought them to Torgsin. And Torgsin reported that those bars, silver bars that people were bringing, still had this betraying images. Hammer and sickle and the slogan "Proletarian of all countries unite" that are on the Soviet coins, right? So, and Torgsin began, and government began a war against the population when they prohibited Torgsin to accept such such silver, but that people improved the quality of their work. These betraying images disappeared, but they continued to do it. So you see how creative and resourceful people were, and really you can't list all the possible methods that they used at that time. So there were other possibilities, and it's not like people could be done with one source. Like Torgsin would provide for everything, or ration card would provide for everything. They were buying whatever it was available. They were buying everywhere where they could. So they used all these possibilities. You're welcome. Yes.
Well, I just have a quick question. It's related maybe to that. So, and it's pure curiosity. So these, as you were saying, these local workers of sort of not elite status are handling some really valuable things. And I'm just wondering, was there documented corruption, documented, like the temptation in dealing with these objects must have been very strong. Control over the buying and selling must have been.
You mean within Torgsin, if there was embezzlements and oh yeah, of course. Just imagine, yeah. And there were small things that people stole, like an apple or like a cookie, right? And some stole big, right? Big embezzlements by the directors of the stores.
Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah, and a lot of documentation on different methods how to steal and how they made money. The government actually, in addition to punishment, to those people who were arrested and didn't have the right to work in the network of Torgsin anymore. Also tried kind of to use a carrot here, policy of carrot. During the rationing system, those who worked in Torgsin, they received the so-called gold rations. They were really gold, meaning that people could have food from Torgsin stores, the employees of Torgsin, but they paid in rubles for them. And they paid the cooperative prices. So by doing this, the government tried to decrease the temptation to steal. But still, we see a lot of examples. And they were so-called товарищеский суд, like trials within Torgsin, within stores, when core workers judged each other and searched each other. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly that a tremendous amount of gold was stolen during the Civil War in Russia. I'm just wondering, today, is there any prominent individuals in Russia whose wealth is suspected to have originated from that gold that was stolen?
No, I mean the state treasury, not private gold. But what happened with the gold reserve of the Russian Empire, that was the period of the First World War, and the front line was coming very close to the capital, St. Petersburg, right? Petrograd, they changed the name during the First World War. So when the communists took power, what they did, they were afraid of losing it. They transported it to the Volga River, to Kazan. And during the Civil War, the city went to like not the Bolshevik government. And then they transported this gold reserves to Siberia. It ended up in the hands of Admiral Kolchak. And only after the Bolshevik took Siberia back from the White Guards, then they returned that gold reserve from that. So you see, it's traveled from St. Petersburg to Kazan, from Kazan to Siberia, from Siberia back to Moscow, to the central part. And on this way, some parts were lost, stolen, right, or used, because the imperial government and then the provisional government after the February Revolution, they used this gold to pay war credits. They were still fighting. So this, so when I said it was stolen, I didn't mean that private, something like private possession. So if you mean those who stole this gold from the treasury, are they still alive and have this gold? I don't know. Maybe some remnants of it.
There's a host of Soviet action polls, such dozens of Soviet polls about the golden reserves of the empire and its travels.
Yeah, there's an article in English, by the way, about this. So in this book, there is a reference that it shows the whole story, how this gold traveled and changed hands. What my favorite story, by the way, Romania. Romania in 1916, during the First World War, sent its gold reserve for safekeeping to Moscow. Yeah, and if you look at the tables, it's everywhere said the Romanian gold included, and then remained that. I don't know, when Romania became socialist, did they return this gold to Ceausescu or not? So, but that was, they sent it for safekeeping, but it turned to be that they just gave it a gift to the Bolshevik government. Yeah.
One more question.
I thank you for the presentation. I just want to say this, it's the big countrywide, fascinating, very well built, very good working, like miraculous institution that accomplished a lot, existed 5 years, disappeared, created it. Whose idea was it?
Oh, it's
how
a good.
it was run, what part of the government was it under?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the idea of using like money transfers from abroad, it was not new. What was new in this, and even like the imperial gold coins also, even before the Bolsheviks, the imperial government, with the beginning of the First World, tried to encourage people kind of to sell those imperial gold coins to the government in exchange for some privileges, something. What was really revolutionary in Torgsin, that was the household possessions, household items, that small things, spoons, forks, earrings, wedding rings, right? And whose idea it was, we have a name, and there is a chapter in this book. That was the director of one of the Moscow stores. And it's very, in my opinion, symbolic that the idea came not from a political figure, but from a director of a store, so to speak, like people who's involved with trade, because the mentality works differently, right? So that was his idea, and he writes in his letters, I found his letters in the archives, he says that it took 6 months for him to convince the government that the idea was worth implementing, right? So he says that I went through like many difficulties trying to implement this idea, right? But when they implemented it, that was Klondike. They just opened that golden mine, right? And that was really revolutionary, because the amount of imperial gold coins is limited, but the amount of household possessions was much bigger, because pretty much every family, even as I showed on the case of that novel, Victor Afanasyev, that they had small things like small gold crosses, like on chains, some simple earrings, silver or gold. And if you take the population of the country, 170 million people, right? And each family has at least something, and the famine is so severe. And when you combine it, you will see that we're dealing really with a big amount, little by little, but we have mountains of valuables.
Yeah. As rather than what government agency?
It was it was under the jurisdictions of the People's Commissariat of Trade. Yes, it was a part.
Because I'm wondering, because it was a countrywide, so thousands of employees, very sophisticated logistics. You should monitor any cases of corruption, so it's huge apparatus.
Yeah, exactly. That was a big apparatus, big network that grew during the famine. Of course, I didn't have time to say all the interesting things about Torgsin, but one of my favorite, these are the directors of Torgsin, and there were 3. 2 of them were executed, repressed during the Great Terror. Later, Torgsin already did not operate at that time. But you see how with the new director, you see how the role of Torgsin changes. During the mass famine, the director of Torgsin was Artur Stashevsky. Artur Stashevsky was one of the founders of the Soviet espionage network in Europe, and the founder of the Soviet fur industry, also like soft gold currency. He was among the major participants of the operation of 1936-37, when the gold reserve of Spain during the civil war in Spain was transported on the 4 Soviet ships to Odessa and then to the vaults in Moscow. In exchange for military help, the Soviet Union was supposed to buy weapons for the Republicans in Spain, right? So a big figure was a director of this enterprise, somebody who distinguished himself already as a spy, as a founder of the fur industry, and later as one of Stalin's agents in Spain, who was an active participant of this Operation X, it was called, when the gold reserve for Spain was transported to Moscow. Yeah. So a lot of interesting things.
With that very interesting story.
There is one last thing. Okay.
So the people accumulate larger amounts of gold, earrings, whatever, before going to the Torgsin? Or could they say, for example, oh, today I'm really desperate, I'm going to take my ring and I'm going to bring it? would they be able to get something with like a pair of earrings or one ring, or would they need?
You
more?
could bring whatever you want, and as a matter of fact, peasants, they were very careful. Yeah, they were bringing by small parts. They would cut a small part and bring it to Torgsin. And it was a good strategy because, you know, Torgsin was a part of Soviet trade, and it had all the problems what the Soviet trade had: shortages, disruptions, very poor assortment, bad quality of goods. And there were, in many instances, people brought their valuables to Torgsin because there was an announcement that Torgsin was going to sell flour. All right, so they received these paper coupons that, by the way, had an expiration day, right? So, and then it turned to be that there was not that much flour, and in 1-2 days the flour is low, the sales are over, and what to do with those coupons, right? There's nothing to buy. So people were bringing by small parts. So like normally a regular customer was somebody with small amounts of valuables. No one brought big amounts.
So how much flour, for example, did you get for like one ring?
A lot, yeah, a lot. But it will depend on a purity of your gold. Prices were based on the weight and also on purity of precious metal, right? There was they calculated based on the certain tables, right? How much it should be. The prices in Torgsin is a very interesting phenomenon, because if you look at them, they seem to be very low, like 5 golden kopecks for a kilo of flour, right? But when you think about it, that it's not just kopecks. There are real valuables behind it. And if you compare Torgsin prices with the world market prices, you see that they were very high. In one of the reports, the last director of Torgsin wrote that Torgsin prices for food are higher than in Poland and even in Paris. And also, he compared what you can buy for one, for example, franc in France for $1 here, right? And what you can buy for an equivalent in the Soviet Union. And you see that in the Soviet case, very small amounts that you could buy.
Well, thank you. I think the quantity of questions is.
And there are still more interesting things. So, guys, I hope that you will find this book interesting and useful for your research. And thank you for coming.
Very much. Thank you to our Zoom. Lots of you joined us on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. And I will be seeing you at dinner. I'm just going to run off and do something.
Yeah, that's good.